Welcome, everybody, to the McKeen's podcast again. This time we're going to be discussing the World Junior Championships, which just wrapped up with the United States winning gold. Hopefully, everybody had a chance to read our World Junior pre-tournament guide, which our predictions actually ended up doing pretty well. I know personally, I had the exact three nailed with the U.S., Sweden, and Czechia taking the gold, silver, and bronze. What about you, Josh and Derek? How did your guys' predictions do?
No, far less good. I think I overestimated Canada a little bit this year, unfortunately. It's always tough with the Canadian team at this tournament. Sometimes they're phenomenal. Sometimes they just can't quite get their legs under them. And that was one of those years this year. And but I think everyone expected a little more out of Canada this year than we saw.
Yeah, I think I got it wrong as well, but I had Canada bronze. I swapped. I think I had Sweden for gold and US for silver. So at least I had the gold medal game right.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully nobody strips me of my Canadian passport, but I actually mentioned in our prediction piece that Canada would lose to Czechia in the quarterfinals, or I believe I said Czechia or Slovakia. Just the way that it looked like it was going to line up. So just being in Oakville for part of that training camp, I just didn't see it from this team. I just didn't see that it factor. I didn't see the speed. I didn't see the scoring ability. The CIS All-Star team, which should not be taken lightly. I think a lot of people, when that camp happens, think that the Canadian team should destroy this CIS team. People don't realize that this CIS team is former CHL stars that just didn't go on to serious pro careers. These were guys that were really good players in the CHL, and now they're a little bit older, they're a little bit stronger, quicker. So it's natural that they're going to give the team a good fight, but I just didn't see them really dominating any of those games that they played against them, and I thought that was sort of ominous, and I just didn't see it from this Canadian roster this year. So hopefully nobody strips my Canadian passport, which would be very unfortunate, but next year will be a little bit different. I mean, Derek, with you sort of having high hopes, and I know Josh, I'll get to you in a second, but I know you specifically had high hopes for Canada at this event. What do you think? Was it the speed factor, the scoring factor, like I just mentioned? Was it something else that you think was Canada's undoing?
Well, to use a popular term nowadays, I think it was mostly vibes. It's for a lack of a better term to explain it. This team just never seemed to have enough chemistry. This never seemed to click. I mean, I didn't watch them in Oakville at the pre-tournament games, but I'd heard the same things. And, that's what we saw out of this team at this tournament. On paper, a lot of great players, decent balance, talent at forward and defense. Goaltending was a bit of a question mark, but I think we kind of got what we expected out of it. But yeah, just a lot of very good players just never seem to find their game. I mean, Matt Poitras was in the NHL this season, looking great for the Boston Bruins. He couldn't quite make it work at the tournament. Matt Savoie, even though he was fighting off an injury, just never quite left the kind of impact we were expecting. The team just never seemed to really gel. They never seemed to be firing on all cylinders at any point in the tournament, start to finish. Maybe that comes down to coaching. Maybe it comes down to a lack of familiarity amongst the players. I mean, there were some players who played together or have known each other for a while. Savoie and Connor Geekie have been teammates in the WHL for seasons, but it just seemed like the team just never really gelled. Maybe a lack of experience as well. If I recall, I think Owen Beck was the only returning player from last year, and he was used as the 13th forward last year. So experience, familiarity, chemistry. I don't think it was necessarily the hockey skills that were lacking on this roster, but it was just more of like those intangible things that I think just never really came together for the team.
Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Derek nailed that. But as well, I think this team, especially as the tournament went on, I think you really saw that this team did lack confidence. Like you saw some overpassing, they wouldn't take it into the slot overly, and they gave up a lot of opportunities where they could have got pucks on net, where they could have had scoring chances, and they would pass it off. So I think there was individually, we just didn't really have that game breaker, that one or two, three players that could really take over the game. We saw a lot of, better term, maybe I'll call them support players. But there weren't really players that took over the game. I think we saw Macklin Celebrini show that potential, and maybe next year, if he's not in the NHL, he could be that player. But I think we were kind of hoping that Savoie, Poitras, Minten would be those guys that could take over games, but they really didn't show that. And I think that was a worry heading into the tournament, and it obviously was kind of their undoing as the tournament went on, especially when the games really mattered.
Yeah, I think you guys nailed it. Honestly, it's tough when you're relying on a draft-eligible player like we did with Celebrini, right? It's just unfair. I know that in previous years we have been spoiled, like last year with Connor Bedard taking over that tournament. But I just thinking that Celebrini would be the savior of this team was just a little bit unfair. And I think we saw that as we progressed into the medal round and played some more difficult teams in the round robin as well. Celebrini was great when we played, call it non-dominant traditional countries. And when the competition ramped up against Sweden, against Czechia in the quarterfinals, Celebrini just wasn't as dominant. And I think that's to be expected. Whenever you're relying on a draft-eligible player at this event, that double underager, it's very difficult for them to be those leaders on a team. We needed other people to step up. It just didn't happen. Okay, so let's talk about some good surprises of the tournament. Enough about Canada's undoing. Was there a player or a team that really surprised you in this tournament? Derek, why don't you go first?
Yeah, the guy who really stood out to me in this regard was Isaac Howard on the United States. I mean, Howard is obviously a good prospect. He's a first-round pick of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Was really, really good at the national team development program in his draft year. But I was a little unsure about him. I mean, he had a really rough freshman year in the NCAA, wound up changing colleges and teams. Has had a nice bounce back year in his sophomore season, but I just wasn't really expecting a whole lot out of him. I didn't think he'd be getting a lot of minutes. I didn't think he'd be a very big impact player, but man, was I ever wrong. Talk about making the most of your minutes and just kind of punching above your weight class. He was great. Scored some huge goals for that team. Most notably the 2 goals in the gold medal game against Sweden. He was playing on his toes the whole tournament, playing a lot of jump, just making a really, really outsized impact for the role he was on and the amount of ice time he was getting. I just thought he was super confident, really smart, really aware of what was going on. It was really generating those quality chances for the American team. And yeah, I thought it was a great showing for him, and probably felt great for him considering what I was just saying about the rough freshman year and the change. I mean, talk about finding a way to build your confidence back up.
Josh, what about you?
Yeah, I wrote an article ahead of the World Juniors about I don't want to call them over or underrated, but overlooked prospects that maybe people weren't talking about heading into the tournament, and one of them was Slovakian Servac Petrovsky. However, I didn't really expect him to be as dominant as he was. Leading that Slovakian team in points, he tied with Nazar, but with Nazar, Dvorsky, and Ondrej, I thought Petrovsky was arguably the best Slovakian player in most games. Obviously, he didn't get a point in that important game against Finland, quarterfinals, but heading into that, I thought he was really, really good. Obviously, this was his 3rd World Junior, so he's got some experience, but he just really impressed me with his ability to kind of take over and be the star of that team. I don't think anyone expected that. But I think everybody has to be pretty happy with his performance. Everyone's probably hoping that he showed up a little bit more in that final game against Finland again, but he was dominant, and I was really impressed with his performance.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to go back to Canada. I know we just talked about how disappointing Canada's performance was at the event, but I do think that Maveric Lamoureux really had a good tournament for Canada on the back end. I thought he was Canada's most reliable and consistent defender. Going back to his draft here, I really didn't know what to make of Lamoureux, and I know our scouting staff was very split on him as well. But I think he's progressed really well, and I thought he had a really good tournament, and I definitely see a path to being a really solid NHL player for him. Maybe not a top pairing guy, but somebody who could anchor a penalty kill, somebody who can play really solid number 4, 20 minutes a night type of role. And I didn't really know what to expect of him coming into this tournament either. So he was definitely a really nice, pleasant surprise for me. Okay, so on the flip side, we're going to talk about the biggest disappointments of the tournament. Could be a player or a team. Josh, why don't you go first with this one?
Yeah, for sure. I think we've already mentioned him, but Matty Courtois, I think obviously he was the late addition to that Canadian roster, and that announcement, everyone was kind of, the thought was, okay, now they've got their guy, they've got the star of the team, he'll kind of take over, he can play in the NHL this season, this is a huge ad, and didn't really see it. To be on that Canadian roster and only put up 4 points in 5 games, honestly, watching the Canadian games, you didn't really notice him. He kind of faded into the background a little bit. I was really, really hoping that he would be the guy on the team, and he just didn't really deliver. It's kind of crazy because then he goes back to the NHL and he gets 2 assists in his first game. So I was really hoping that he would be able to take that team to the next level, and the fact that he didn't, he kind of faded into the background, I think is a little bit disappointing. And I'm sure he's kind of disappointed with that performance, but I mean, he's doing well in the NHL, so I guess that's the end goal, right?
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying with Poitras. For me, I thought he actually had a decent tournament. I think that it was just deployment issues. I didn't really think that there was anybody who really gelled with him. And I think he's the type of player, having watched him a lot in the OHL, that's going to be as good as his wingers are. He's somebody that drives play with his hockey sense and his IQ and his passing ability. And I felt like there was a lot of shifts where he was getting things done, but his line mates weren't, and there just wasn't that support for him. He was never going to be a guy, in my opinion, that was going to be able to take over games for Canada. He was going to be a nice, solid, complementary piece, and I think ultimately that's what he ends up being at the NHL level too, a really solid middle six guy. So maybe with him being that NHL guy who did end up coming to the tournament, maybe expectations were just sort of too high on him, and that brings me to my pick for this would be Fraser Minten as the Canadian captain. I think with the preseason he had with the Maple Leafs as well, and almost making that team and coming into this tournament with fairly high expectations and being deployed alongside Macklin Celebrini, it just didn't seem to fit. I feel like he was sort of miscast in this tournament, and quite frankly, I don't really think he stood out in any way in this tournament. I think that he was one of Canada's least effective forwards. And when you're looking at somebody playing a leadership role and with the experience that he has, I think that has to be considered a disappointment. I think that they needed more from him. And like I said, I would have liked to have seen maybe other players used alongside Celebrini. I would have loved to have seen a flank of maybe Rakoff and Matthew Wood with Celebrini in the middle. I think that maybe could have been a little bit more of an effective line. And the fact that they weren't willing to move off of that Minten-Celebrini connection maybe was Canada's undoing or part of Canada's undoing. But overall, he was somebody that I definitely had higher expectations for. Derek, what about you?
Yeah, I'd have to go with Liam Ohgren as my pick for this one. It's just this is his 3rd time at the World Juniors. He's shown previously quite well internationally for Sweden. He was huge for them as their captain at the U18 tournament in his draft year in 2022. And I never really thought that he got his game going this tournament. Didn't really show up on the score sheet. Didn't really leave much of an impact. He was just overall quite disappointing. Now, I will say that he hasn't played a lot this year. He's been battling injuries, so maybe that was playing a part. But I just really was expecting more. And he's also a guy who has previous chemistry with Jonathan Lekkerimaki and Noah Ostlund from the time in Jurgens. So he's a guy that on paper should have had a pretty strong tournament. But I don't know. He just never really found a way to get his game going. He just was kind of invisible for most of the tournament. I thought maybe in the gold medal game on home ice with everything on the line would be the time where he was able to step up his game, but that just never really happened either. It certainly was not the tournament he would have been expecting, or his NHL team, the Minnesota Wild. I'm certainly sure that they would have expected more out of him. So yeah, it's just really tough to see, especially for a guy that was coming back for his third time at this tournament. He just never really provided the skill or the leadership that I think the Swedes were expecting, or probably what he was expecting out of himself.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think all three of those guys are very fair to mention for that particular topic. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about some of the drafted players who impressed us the most. Now, when I was answering this question, I was thinking maybe not necessarily the player who I thought was the best in the tournament, more so along the lines of somebody who really impressed me. I kind of looked at it similar to the surprise topic that we already talked about. Maybe guys that I think needed to have really good tournaments and did have really good tournaments. So I'm going to start things off. And the first two names that I'm going to bring to the table here are Noah Ostlund and Frank Nazar. For Ostlund, I think the expectation was that he was going to be one of the better players in the tournament. And I think he was. Personally, I thought he was Sweden's best forward over Lekkerimaki. I thought he did a lot more of his damage between the dots, and whereas Lekkerimaki was more of that high volume shooter from the outside, a lot more dangerous on the power play. I thought at even strength, Ostlund drove play a little bit more consistently. I was just really impressed with his ability to work in transition and to create scoring chances on a consistent level. Whereas Frank Nazar, I feel like we kind of left him for dead last year. He battled injuries last year in the NCAA. Kind of was a forgotten man. And this year, he seems to be fully healthy. He's playing a lot better in the NCAA. And he came to this tournament and I thought was a really, really strong contributor to a U.S. team. I thought that the speed that we knew he had was on display. I thought he was a really good and consistent play creator for them in sort of a secondary scoring role. And I think that he's somebody who is starting to get things going and getting back on track. And I was really happy to see him have a really strong tournament. Derek, who were the two guys that came to mind for you?
Yeah, so one of the guys was Lekkerimaki. And I do agree with what you were saying about him and Ostlund and just the different kind of strengths they brought to that Swedish roster. Whereas Ostlund was more of the play driver, Lekkerimaki was the finisher. And I mean, in that role, he was certainly exceptional. And he was very, very confident with that one-timer, working the power play. And the results were certainly coming for him. And you could see it almost brought a little bit of spring into the step of the Swedes at times. There were different points throughout the tournament where the team was in a tight game or needed a big goal. And, Lekkerimaki was able to consistently deliver, which I thought was really, really big, really, really noticeable. He didn't have the best year in his draft plus one. He's really come on strong this year, has been one of the better under 20 players in the SHL, arguably the best under 20 player in the SHL. So it was really nice to see him bring that confidence to this stage. And obviously, things didn't quite go according to plan in the gold medal game, but it's hard to be upset with the performance that he had overall, just scoring big goal after big goal. So that was really great for him. The other one that I was really impressed by was Ryan Leonard of the United States. And it was just such a prototypical Leonard kind of performance. It wasn't the guy who always showed up the most on the score sheet, but a guy who was always just making a consistent positive impact for his team. Just with the speed and power that he's always shown. He was just such an impactful player, really great at driving play up the ice, really great at getting the puck towards the net and creating things. And he had that huge goal late in the third period in the gold medal game. Did the little bit of a cocky hushing to the Swedish fans. But I mean, that's just Leonard, right? Just supremely confident player, doesn't back down from a challenge, just leaves such a strong impact shift over shift, even though it doesn't always show up in the stat sheet. And for a guy that's eligible to be back next year, if he's not in the NHL, I mean, boy, like if the United States is looking for a gold medal repeat, and he's back on their roster, I mean, they're going to be a very, very hard team to beat with, kind of with the momentum that he and the rest of his team showed this year.
Yeah, that Leonard Smith Pro line is just so strong because of the chemistry that they have from playing so long together. And I think what's interesting, and I know from our discussions at last year's draft, I think you guys know that I'm a big Ryan Leonard fan, and he was somebody that I pushed for us to have ranked fairly high. Honestly, and you guys can agree or disagree here, I really am starting to believe that of the three of them, Ryan Leonard is going to be the best pro. And I that's not saying that I think that the other two are not going to be strong pro players. I just see something in Leonard's game that's going to translate so well to being a high-end NHL player. Do you guys agree, disagree?
I saw you had Leonard written down, and he was a guy that I had on that I wanted to talk about here too, and I ultimately took him off for a couple others. But yeah, I was just really impressed with him and his ability to kind of find that open ice to make things happen consistently.
I would still probably lean Will Smith by a hair, although that gap is closing. I think that Leonard has obvious advantages now in terms of his physical development. And I think that to a degree, someone like Will Smith, who's maybe not quite as physically developed yet, I think he'll grow in that regard once he starts transitioning to the pro level. But yeah, it's very, very close between those two for me.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually have a couple of St. Louis Blues prospects, and I'm going to stick with Sweden for both. So the first one, maybe we should have seen this coming. Otto Stenberg, just based on what he did last year at the U18s, at the Hlinka, at the Junior A Challenge. He was just so good internationally. But coming into this roster, the juniors, with that big line, with all the top prospects they have forward, I didn't really think that he would be able to take over as much as he did. He only played 14 minutes a game, and he was arguably one of the best Swedish forwards. I just think that his ability to create offense was very impressive. He seemed to always drive play into the offensive zone, even though he was playing a third line role. He just showed a really, really high competitive edge, and it paid off with 9 points through the tournament. I think he really impressed me. He's eligible to come back next year, and he could be one of the top guys. I wasn't expecting him to be as consistent as he was, and it really stood out. And then the other one, Theo Lindstein, he was a late addition to this roster. He wasn't even supposed to be at the World Juniors. And the fact that he came in and led the tournament in assists and points for a defenseman, he was arguably the best defender on that Swedish line, offensively at least. And with all of the star power they had on the blue line, I just think that was really, really impressive. Obviously, it does help that he was playing with Tom Melander, who kind of covered the defensive side of it a little bit more, but we really saw some high creativity. He didn't sacrifice anything defensively, though. He provided a really, really use that word, consistent two-way presence. And he's eligible to come back next year, and he could be, based on this, he could be the guy at next year's World Juniors. But I was just really impressed with how, as a late addition, he could come into the roster and, again, be in that conversation as the top defender on Sweden's team.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That Wilander-Lindstein pairing was just so dominant defensively for Sweden. They were so good in transition. They were just great. And Derek, I actually want to touch on that a little bit because I know that you were not the biggest Lindstein fan heading into last year's draft. Did he kind of alter your opinion a little bit from this World Juniors?
To a degree, I would agree. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to put too much stock into a single tournament, especially where a guy like Lindstein has the advantage of being on home ice, with home fans there in Sweden. But yeah, I mean, I can't say anything bad really about the tournament he had. One of the concerns I had about him back in his draft year was just a little bit of like lackadaisical play at times. I just found he wasn't often driving play. He wasn't really an impact player. He was too hesitant a lot of the times, too passive, just wasn't really making a big impact at either ends of the ice. But at this tournament, he was more confident, he was more active, he was more engaged, and he was leaving much more of an impact in all three zones, just with his decision making and his puck play. And I did really like him. I would have to say that I probably like him more than I did before. I'm still maybe a little skeptical as to how high he got drafted. If I had a chance to go back and redo that draft, I don't think I would still pick him as high as St. Louis did in the first round, but he certainly earned some brownie points in my eyes with his play at this tournament.
All right, so fair enough. Now let's segue, at least in my opinion, it's a perfect segue into the undrafted player who impressed us the most. So that could be somebody who is first-time draft eligible. It could be somebody who has been passed over in previous years. And Derek, I want to start with you because your selection is somebody who has been previously passed over.
Yeah, Ondrej Becher or Becher. I've heard it pronounced different ways, but I'll just say Becher because it's a little easier for me to say. So for those who don't know, he plays this year in Prince George in the WHL and has for the last couple of years. And he's been passed over in 2 drafts, but he's having such a strong breakout season. Prince George is one of the best teams in WHL this year. And Becher is a huge part of that roster. I think he's gone under the radar with how much of an impact he leaves on a team that also has Riley Heidt as more of the star. And at this tournament, I just thought he was really, really solid from start to finish and capped it off with that amazing 5-point performance in the bronze medal game for Czechia. Had 3 goals, 2 assists, a huge goal in the second period to keep the Czechs in it. He had the game-tying goal, added an empty netter. He's just a very solid all-around player. He plays center. He's quick. He's competitive. He's good with the puck. He sees the ice well in both ends. He kills penalties. He works well in different places on the power play. I thought he was almost going under the radar a little bit on that Czechia team. He just wasn't having a lot of success in the big moments, even though he was generating offense and making good plays throughout games. So it was really nice to see him have a really strong ending to that tournament, probably the game of his career or his life so far, to help Czechia, come from behind and win that bronze at the end. And with regards to him in the drafts, he's a guy that even coming into this tournament, I was kind of looking at him as a possible top 100 pick just because he really has been that good. Maybe he's one of those guys whose development was thrown off kilter a little bit because of the pandemic, because I think that happened to a lot of guys, just considering how old he is now and, how much his game was impacted in the prime developmental years over the last couple of years. So I think he's been a guy who's really established himself, and I definitely think he's going to be a guy who draws a lot of draft attention heading into 2024 because he's so well-rounded. He already plays a very pro style of game, and there's just a lot of things to like about him that should translate to the higher levels.
Josh, who was your pick?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this, and I just really wanted to talk about Leon Muggli on that Swiss roster. Obviously, he had the cross-checking penalty and was suspended a game, but in that final game, he was spectacular, and obviously he had the faith of the coaches playing 26 minutes in that loss to Sweden in the quarterfinals. But he obviously not offensively, he only had 1 assist through the tournament, but he really proved that he's going to be the guy. I think coming into the tournament, obviously the Swiss had Dionisio, they had Daniel Ustikov, who has been getting some attention in this draft class, and Mugli's been a little bit underrated, under the radar, and he did look like he could be the guy moving forward. He'll have a couple more turns at this, and obviously the Swiss kind of impressed in this tournament, and I think he's going to be the guy. He showed he was on the second power play unit. He made some great passes. He drew some key penalties. He showed two-way presence. There's obviously some work to be done. But that when the pressure was on, he really, really impressed. And that final game against Sweden, obviously they were under attack that whole game, but he held his own, and he really stood out. I think I don't really know where he's going to plug into the draft yet, if he's maybe in that second round for me, maybe in the third, but he's been really, really good in the Swiss National League this year. And I think he's going to start to get some more attention as we get closer to the draft. But yeah, that final game just really, really stood out to me. So I just wanted to give him a nod in this discussion.
Yeah, I think the interesting question that sort of topic brings to light is, has Muggli definitively passed Ustinkov as a draft prospect? Now he was unquestionably better, in my opinion, at the Hlinka Gretzky. He's been better in Switzerland this year, and now was much more impactful at the World Juniors. That's sort of 3 for 3. Obviously, Ustinkov does have those more intriguing physical tools, and maybe that ultimately makes him better in the long run. But I just think that Muggli is just a little bit safer, and I think does have probably a similar sort of pro upside as a sort of middle of the lineup defender. Are you guys sort of on that same page? Derek, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would have to agree. I definitely thought Muggli had a much better tournament than Ustinkov overall. He's passed him in my eyes between the two, if you were to compare them head to head. And I really think it speaks volumes about the Swiss coaches and how they used both players. In that last game, Ustinkov just didn't play a lot. And like Josh was saying, like Muggli was all over the ice, played those 26 minutes. And these coaches know those players better than we do. So I think you have to kind of take that into consideration. I'm still not sure what I make of both players overall. I do think there is some pro upside there, but I'm still trying to watch them a little more closely just to get a better feel for kind of how they project. But between the two, I would definitely put Muggli ahead.
I think I'll just jump. I think I would as well. And I think what is maybe not as well known is he's got 9 points in the National League this season in 25 games. That's actually 5th all time in the league for U18 defender. And it's actually already ahead of what Roman Josi did back in his U18 year. He had 8 points in 35 games. Obviously, it's a different situation. Mugli's getting played a little bit more, but I think just to be in that conversation is kind of impressive. So for me, Muggli is just ahead. But as the year goes on and I kind of dive in a little bit more, I think that gap could grow.
Yeah, and just to make it 4 for 4, I actually talked to Chapin, our resident Central European expert for all things hockey at McKeen's, and he agrees with the fact that Muggli has now passed Ustinkov. So I think probably at our next ranking at McKeen's, we're going to see that represented. So that brings it to my personal favorite undrafted player at the tournament, and that would be Tomas Valgas. I just was so impressed with how he came into the tournament a little bit late after replacing Adam Juracek and pushed his way up that Czechia lineup to be a prominent defender by the end of the tournament for them. And his skating is so strong, and that was always probably going to be the case. It has been any time I've watched him. That's the first thing that stands out. I think what stood out most was the fact that he was willing to do battle, and he was engaged physically, and he was confident with the puck, and all things that sometimes draft eligible players, younger double underagers, struggle with at this event, especially on the blue line. And he didn't struggle at all, in my opinion. And I thought that he was somebody who really helped his draft stock at this tournament. I know you mentioned it earlier, Derek. It is worth mentioning that it is only one tournament. It shouldn't have cause a huge swing on certain things in terms of draft stock. In my opinion, it shouldn't hurt a player's stock. But I think when you look at a guy like Galvis coming into this tournament, I think it definitely has to help his draft stock with how well he played. And obviously, it's interesting to me that we chose sort of 3 guys that are a little bit less prominent. We didn't talk about Macklin Celebrini. We didn't talk about Ziboyam. We didn't even talk about Jesse Pulkkinen for the Finns, who played such a large role for them. So I think it's interesting that there were sort of 3, we'll call them unheralded guys that stood out the most for us. Okay, so next year, Ottawa, 2025. What are our predictions? I'm going to go first if you guys don't mind. And I think this is Sweden's tournament to lose. I know it's on home ice for us in Canada. I do expect us to be better next year. I think that our 05 crop and 06 crop are better overall than our 04 crop, which we saw this year. And obviously with it being on home ice is an advantage. The Americans do get to return quite a few players. But when you look at that Swedish roster and all those guys that they're able to return, how dominant that 05 and 06 group were at the U18s, I just look at it as Sweden sort of being the favorite next year. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think that there's so many players on that Swedish roster that are coming back. There's so much talent that they have in the ranks. Canada, I think, will have a better roster. That I don't think that there's any question there. So I think they'll be back into the medal conversation, but I do think that you're right, that it is Sweden's tournament to lose. I'll be interested to see how the U.S. does. I think they might take a bit of a step back, but there is still quite a bit of talent there. So they'll be a big question mark. And it'll be interesting to see some of these lower teams. Like, can the Swiss come back? I was kind of impressed with them throughout the tournament, and so it would be nice to see them repeat in the quarterfinals. See how much damage they can cause. Those lower teams are always fun to watch because they can cause so much havoc, so much chaos. So that was a lot of fun. But yeah, I think you nailed it. That Sweden should be the team to watch.
For me, I would have to go with the United States here, much as it pains me to say it as a Canadian. But I will say it also depends on who they can bring back. So if they can bring back that Boston College trio of Will Smith, Ryan Leonard, and Gabe Perreault, I think that would make them the strong favorites in my eyes. And they're going to be bringing back some other key players as well. Trey Augustine between the pipes. He was really a solidifying presence for that team. Coming back from illness for the final games, and he was really, really solid. You've got Z Bouillon who can come back on the blue line. Aaron Minetian, he didn't play a lot I don't think he played at all this tournament as their extra guy, but he'll be back. There's still going to be a lot of question marks filling out that roster because they will be losing a lot of good players from this year. But James Hagens could be there or was likely to be there. Same with Cole Iserman. The Canadian team next year will be a big question mark. It's going to depend on who's strong with their club teams. Macklin Celebrini will probably be in the NHL. I don't think we'll see him. It's hard to know exactly what that Canadian roster would look like. But for right now, if the United States is able to bring back all the guys that are eligible next year that they had this year, that would make them the favorites in my eyes.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode of the McKeen's podcast. Hope you all enjoyed listening. Hope you all enjoyed watching the World Juniors. I know we all did. It's one of the best times of the year, and just great that it happens over the holidays, which is also magical. So thank you for listening, and until next time.